System riding to the core. Yeah. Reppin' inner city left.
ICL Pod Inner City Left, Amin TMK, along with Emoja Lil Tanky Sumler, as well as, by popular request, the Ghost in the Shell, Keita DeMuscle. What's up, y'all? How are y'all doing?
What's up, everybody?
At the turn of the tide.
At the turn of the tide. Y'all may have been watching some of our videos, or you may know us from our podcast days. This is sort of our podcast. Podcast broadcast. I don't know if that's redundant, but this is going to be
more days.
What was that suggestion, Ghost?
More podcasts, more days.
More podcasts, more days. Yeah. No, the news never stops, so we can't stop either. We thought it'd be a great idea today to talk about all, or I don't want to say all because that's not possible. We're going to talk about as many as the major flashpoints in the world as we can. I have two amazing people with me to help me discuss that. Any thoughts before we jump right in, friends? All right, let's talk about this. I think there are several places we could start, but I will start in the Middle East with Palestine. Palestine right now, obviously, we know currently on the ground, the Israelis, the IDF, are pushing into Rafah. There was an attack last night. There are several other people involved. Before we get started on all of that, I just wanted to ask both of you sort of, obviously the stakes are very big, but what are our response right now to Palestine and Israel in that current conflict in relation to the larger conflict of possibly World War III?
I gotta say, man, this is a big reason why I like to use the phrase "the Levant," because it covers so many of these areas, and it seems to be a little bit less. You can't slant it one way or the other, right? When you say the Levant, you're talking about Syria, you're talking about Lebanon, you're talking about Jordan, you're talking about Egypt, and you're talking about Palestine, Israel. The entire Levant is engaged, whether they want to be or not. When I talk about this spilling out and becoming a larger regional war, we're seeing signs of this. For almost 2 weeks, you've had Sisi and in Egypt talking about, maybe we might have to tear up, the Camp David Accords, which go all the way back to Jimmy Carter, 78, right? You had Israel at war with Egypt. People act like they've been at peace forever, but they really haven't, and then just over the last 24 hours, we're hearing reports that IDF Merkava tanks opened fire past the Rafah line into Egypt and have killed Egyptian service members.
That's breaking news.
That's breaking news.
On the heels of the International Court of Justice ordering Israel to stop its attack in Rafah, and Israel tripled down instead.
And there are no accidents, right? There are no coincidences because, again, when the last 2 weeks we've had Egypt talking about joining alongside with South Africa in the ICJ case. So now all of a sudden, accidentally, Egyptian service members are being fired on. And there's been all kinds of reports of lots of shuttle diplomacy behind the scenes and on the scenes with the Department of State, talking to Sisi saying, hey, you cannot under any circumstances join with this South African plight, which again is a very interesting thing to me, right? Because Egypt feels like now they have been slighted as well. They, alongside with Qatar, presented this alongside Langley, by the way. The head of the CIA was in Egypt for these talks, and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire on all of these terms. It was the deal. It was a deal. It was too good to be true. It was a quite generous deal. And Hamas accepted. And Israel was like, nah, right? So now you have Egypt feeling like they got egg in their face because you go out, you tell these people, hey, look, this is what it's going to be. Do you want peace? And the people are like, whatever, sure. They sign their name. And then the people that you vouch for are like, nah. And it just goes to show that Netanyahu will not allow peace on any level. His entire presidency is tied up in there being a continuation of the war. And one way or the other, they will find a way to engage Lebanon in proper war, and they continue to look for ways to involve Iran.
Yeah. So, and then, I mean, again, that's a great point. So you just mentioned Egypt. That's breaking news. I believe an Egyptian soldier has died, has been killed. So you have that flashpoint. Obviously, Sisi, who is the president of Egypt, is a Western-leaning president. So let's keep it in that region again, because like you said, all of these Arab countries and the world, let's be real, even American colleges, 20-year-olds with blue hair are out here, and they're just, they're upset about it. So obviously the Arab world is up in arms, at least the people are. So in that area, you also have Lebanon. Now, Lebanon is important. Why? Why are, in terms of the larger global conflict? Because obviously the Hezbollah and where is Hezbollah in terms of where are they at right now in terms of this conflict?
I mean, Hezbollah is the boogeyman, right? That's the one force that the IDF has failed to have a significant victory over in the past 20 years. Every time they go up against Hezbollah, they get a bloody nose. In fact, it was Hezbollah alone that spooked even the great, never scared Ronald Reagan when they did the strike in Beirut and 400 American soldiers died. Ronald Reagan packed his bags and sent the Americans home the very next day. That same Hezbollah has been the boogeyman of this region, right? We can talk about ISIS for whatever you feel like they are or aren't. You can talk about other Arabic terror groups, right? But Hezbollah doesn't see themselves in that light. They see themselves as a resistance movement, even though they are Shia Arab. Well, Hezbollah are Sunni or
Sunni.
Shia Arabs. No, they are Shia Arabs.
Oh, okay.
Right? They're Shia Arabs, right? But it's not so much a religious struggle for them as a resistance struggle. And you can make the same argument for Hamas and the Qassam.
Yeah, so again, Hezbollah, a big player here. Also wanted to mention Syria. Syria, obviously, there has been American troops there. There's been Russian troops there. There is a conflict with Assad and possibly Western-backed forces. Where do you see Syria amongst this global state of conflict?
Syria is a wild card in many ways because there are so many forces there. So you have the separatist forces that are essentially backed by Turkey. You have separatist forces that are backed by Langley. You have separatist forces that are backed by the Pentagon. And these guys fight amongst themselves sometimes, to say nothing of the forces of Hezbollah that work throughout Syria. You have the Revolutionary Guard with Iran operating in Syria. You have the Russians operating in Syria, and you have the proper Syrian military. So that is just a lot of factions that all have relatively contemporary weapons that are able to project power in different ways. It was less than 3 months ago where the forces operating in that are nominally tied to Iran, at least they're Shia, and so there's always this presumption that they're taking orders from Iran.
From Iran, right?
Right. That had strikes within Syria and Iraq proper that killed American servicemen. Now, the scuttlebutt was these things didn't actually happen in Jordan, but happened in Syria, in which case you're in a very interesting place because literally the Americans have no justification. For anyone that bemoans the Russian presence in Crimea, you have to then ask yourself, without a United Nations mandate or without a proclamation from American Congress of war on Syria, how then can you justify an American military presence in Syria?
Yeah, great points. So we touched on this before because we were talking about Palestine, but I want to just also touch on Hamas also, as again, we talk about this, a militia group, an asymmetrical tactical fighting group. And we are seeing now, again, this conversation surrounding, Anthony Blinken, or I forget, someone said this, that eroding Hamas's leadership, but also I think it's important to acknowledge that they're just flat out losing right now. If other than the incredible amount of civilian casualties, anywhere between 30,000 to 200,000, if you believe Ralph Nader, so we have all of these are their own little personal powder kegs. So we have Hamas, we have Hezbollah. What were you about to say?
Well, to your point, right? When it comes to the civilians, the IDF is undefeated. But when it comes to actually engaging
there
the
it
enemy,
is.
there has been all kinds of stories. Regularly, you can go on the internet and you can find reports of the resistance fighters destroying IDF tanks. Within the last 48 hours, there's
Destroying drones.
destroying drones, right? With rocks. I mean, real David and Goliath stuff, right? But the real cherry on top is within the last 48 hours, there's been IDF soldiers that surrendered and were taken as prisoners of war. The undominable, undefeatable Israeli defense forces walked into an ambush and begged for their lives.
Also, the assumption that Israel has the best surveillance system, and they have been ambushed successively multiple times in areas all across Gaza. Because Israel's story is, oh no, they're all in Rafah, and that's why we're bombing Rafah. But no, it's been all parts of Gaza. IOF soldiers have encountered resistance.
And it goes to your point, right? They have incredible intelligence gathering powers, right? Maybe second only to the United States. But you have to understand that in intelligence, there's lots of different types of intelligence. Israelis are strong in SIGINT. They intercept signals, digital signals that are sent throughout the internet. Israel is incredibly good at that. But they're not great in human intelligence because they don't have operatives on the ground. There's no one that can reasonably now they have human int on the West Bank, but in the Gaza, there's none. There's no one that is squirreling back to some IDF commander and letting him know, hey, this is this family, this is what they do, this is what this family does. And without human intelligence, there's always going to be catastrophic mistakes as to who is really a combatant and who isn't.
Well, it also speaks to how well resourced and how well organized Hamas is, right? Because they weren't infiltrated, that they were able to keep a lot of secrets and still are today in a way because they had these, that was some of the critiques against Hamas too, that you read in Western media that says like, oh, they didn't trust anybody so badly that people had to undergo background checks. And it's like, well, my people are facing annihilation. And if you are not aligned with me not getting annihilated, then yeah, I'm running a background check to make sure that you're not the ops.
And I just also want to say, right, this is a signal of being too successful in your own thing. If you know that your strength is SIGINT, there's a strong reason to not destroy all the electrical and digital infrastructure so that when people slip up and make phone calls, boom, now you have that. Instead, because of the way that the IDF has conducted this operation in Gaza, there is literally no digital infrastructure that's left. So all of your SIGINT opportunities have been nullified. They've been atrophied.
Great points. Now, that was 2 H's, right? Okay. So I don't know if this is a fun joke for anyone. Haha, wrestling fans. You have Hamas, you have Hezbollah, and you also have the Houthis. The Houthis are in Yemen. You like it, right? You like it, right? They always say, hey, you got to add a little humor, geopolitics. You got to bring people in. Yeah, so you got Triple H, you got Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. The Houthis are, like I said, in Yemen. Can you talk a little bit about like where they are in conflict with Israel and the United States, especially in terms of the Navy and the ships?
The thing about Hezbollah is no matter how strong or weak you assume them to be, they are an irregular fighting force, right? Whereas the Houthis represent a nation state, which is a whole nother level of violence. So you're able to utilize weapon systems that almost no irregular system would be able to utilize. So they're able to project power in a totally different way.
What are some of those would you say that like a nation state could garner, but
Yeah, ballistic missiles is for one, right? Like not like the little shoulder fire stuff you see in these Hollywood movies, but the big missiles. You know what I'm saying? USSR, like scary ones, right? And that's what they're doing with their missile technology. They've been able to project their power into the Mediterranean, into the Red Sea, into the Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. So what they've done is they've made most of the containers, most of the logistics trains that are traveling to Israel, they've shut down the Eilat port, right? People are literally having to go past the Horn of Africa, the Cape of Africa, sail around, right? Not go into the Red Sea and come through the Mediterranean. But now they're able to project power even into the Mediterranean. So they're still able to really affect Israel's ability to bring in things, which goes to why perhaps the Americans felt the need to create a port they could control, because the Israelis, quiet as kept, have their port capacity has been severely diminished in a way that they wish that they debilitated Hamas to the level that their port systems have been debilitated. And this is the difference between what players like the Houthis can do as a nation state. They're actively engaging American naval assets. Like these are the kind of things that really haven't happened since, at the very least, the Vietnam War, but closer to World War II. These are things that you study in war college, but they never happened because the United States doesn't fight what are called near peer rivals. And the Houthis are nowhere near a peer, right? As far as the total hegemonic might of the United States. But what they do have is mastery of this terrain. This is a place where they've lived for thousands of years.
And you would have thought like the United States would have learned that from Afghanistan, in which we encountered the very exact same thing, that of course the indigenous peoples knew their land.
Or waterways, as it were.
Yeah, great points. And we mentioned this a bit earlier. Okay, so you mentioned Iran. I'm not saying that Iran is like a whole separate conversation, but I do feel like it's a bit different. Like again, because you said in terms of the nation states, Iran is much bigger than Yemen in terms of military power. And we have seen over the last few weeks with the several missile strikes that Iran sent into Israel in retaliation for the bombing of the embassy. And we already know that the United States, or at least many people within the United States, would love to see the United States military going and against the Iranians. And I feel like, again, because like you talked about the ICBMs and you talked about missile capability. What makes Iran a little bit different than the other entities that we've talked about in terms of those who are kind of dealing against the U.S. Western?
So Iran's capabilities dwarf everyone that we've named. They dwarf Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, because they are, you could argue, maybe the fifth most developed missile technology in the world. You could argue the Americans, the Chinese, the Russians, and maybe the North Koreans can match them. But there is a strong argument to say that in many ways, you might put them third or fourth.
They needed Tom Cruise. They need Tom Cruise to defeat Iran. We needed him, yeah.
Right. Tom Cruise flies a F-14 that taps out at about max 2.5, right? Mach 2.5. And we're talking about, again, it's a great joke, right? This is really to talk about the technological prowess of Iran. They have reportedly hypersonic missiles that can travel in excess to Mach 5 to Mach 8. So you're talking about twice as fast as, with the Top Gun.
Well, yeah. And I mean, Iran has also been surviving U.S. sanctions. It used to be, until 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, it used to be the most sanctioned country in the world. And it still has the military might that Tinky was just talking about. And it's still able to, I mean, because one of the reasons the United States put sanctions against Iran is that it quote unquote funds terrorism, and we're seeing some of that funding go to.
Yeah, I mean, that's as nebulous a term as you can get these days. I mean, we're funding the Azov Brigade. So what does that mean?
Right. And Iran has been accused of funding Hamas, accused of funding Hezbollah and the Houthis, all of whom have faced horrendous, oppressive U.S. sanctions that starved hundreds of thousands of their people to death.
Yeah, but we have to hear about that while the U.S. backs several different resistance groups all over the world. I mean, we're going to get to that, and I'm so glad we started here because you see how intensely the United States tries to destabilize the Middle East and other areas too, especially who don't have those same capitalistic ideas and vibes.
To lay it down in sense of scope of power for the region, Iran is considered one of the preeminent regional military powers. You can make an argument that maybe Turkey could defeat them, possibly the Saudis, but that's a highly skeptical. And the Israelis see themselves as a match, although from a demographic point of view, the Iranians outnumber them 10-1.
Yeah, I think the conversation, especially as we talked about this, I was thinking in terms of Hamas and Hezbollah and Houthis, in contrast to Iran, is also willingness, and aggressiveness. I mean, Israel is as aggressive and as willing to engage in conflict as any country we've ever seen. I mean, and they continue to, again, if the reports on the Egyptian soldier being killed by the IDF is true, I mean, that's just another conflict that they're prepared to create. And we remember early in this conflict, at least in terms of the hot war since October 7th, we heard Joe Biden say, "Hey, if you want to get involved in this conflict, don't." And he said that with the very parental finger wag. But we see Israel is constantly trying to engage other countries, whether they be state actors or non-state actors, because they know the United States, while whatever the rhetoric may be and however that may ebb and flow for the Democratic Party, the weapons and the backing of Israel remains.
Because they're emulating the United States. We can say that that the genocide that Israel is committing right now has been the worst we've seen, but it's been the worst that we've seen on social media. The atrocities that the United States committed inspired the Nazis. The atrocities that the United States committed against the Native Indigenous people here, against Black people here, some of the historical records that have emerged absolutely emulate and mirror what Israel is doing to the Palestinians and to essentially as many people in the Levant as possible. They don't care who you are. Yeah. And these atrocities get mirrored across the globe. And it does always kind of draw back to what the United States and even the British did when they colonized these lands, because colonized lands demand, the colonizer demands the genocide of the indigenous people so that they can steal those resources and land, or enslave the indigenous people so that they have a free labor force in order to continue their ongoing colonization.
Yeah, and we don't need to go that far back. I mean, George W. Bush killed 1 million Iraqis, right? They invented a law, which has come back to be important again. It's the Hague Invasion Act, right? Just to keep George Bush and any of his administration from ever being tried at the Hague. There's a law on the American books that says they will invade. And it looks like they're attempting to bring Israel under that umbrella now that Bibi Netanyahu and Gallant have been indicted.
Yeah, the Republican majority leader, Mike Johnson, I think.
That's right.
He was already, his rhetoric is already off the chain, and mentioning what was it, the ICC, the people there specifically, I forget. I mean, look, hey, you can always go to inner city.
Tom Cotton and the it was 12 other Republican senators also sent a threatening note to the ICC. Now,
Oh, and Blinken signed on saying, "Yep, I support if we're going to sanction the ICC." Sanction.
So it's across the aisle.
right.
You
So
know?
imagine, right? Though imagine, because there are literally laws in the American books about threatening due process. I mean, if you were to send a threatening letter to a defense attorney, I'm sorry, to a prosecuting attorney or to a judge, that is a felony. Like the U.S. Marshals kick your door down when you do that. And this is literally what we have American senators doing. We have American congressmen. They're writing threatening letters to a body of justice, right, that are simply trying to look into quite observable phenomena that is directly under their purview. This is what this whole court was created to investigate. And now that they're investigating someone that is not an African or not Putin, all of a sudden this is a problem. And this is coming out too. It's not just the Americans that are sending these threats. There is a highly respected, there's a rumor out right now from a source that's saying it was either Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak that wrote a letter to the British prosecutor saying exactly that, right? The ICC and the ICJ do not exist to investigate democracies. They only investigate Africans and thugs like Putin.
Saying the quiet part out loud, which we see more and more happening. Okay, I want to move on this because this is the state of the world. So we could obviously have this conversation over and over again, but I want to move because we just mentioned Vladimir Putin. You would think the way the West speaks about Vladimir Putin, that he was the king of Russia, because
he's not even the scariest guy in Russia, man.
And and it's so interesting that we sort of always have the conversation of, again, the Russian president election happened less than 1 month ago, okay? And we hear all this, because obviously when you talk about a Russian election or any election that is a part of the non-Western, non-capitalist sort of way of ideology, they're always rigged. They're always fake. Everyone's imprisoned and blah, 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 blah. And again, I just want to say to that before I even get started in this whole full conversation surrounding Ukraine and NATO and all of that, Vladimir Putin was democratically elected by a landslide in an election that you have no proof is fraudulent. Not
86% of the Russians allowed to vote voted.
Well, and they had a record voter turnout of 77.5%, I believe.
No, I thought that was the percent that voted for Putin. So you had 89% of the population voted. And
yes,
77%.
yeah, but also they have record voter turnout. Like the United States voter turnout, I think I'll have to look it up.
So it's all fake, basically.
It's all fake when 2/3 of your country come out to vote for the person that they want to elect.
Over 3 weeks, isn't that the election duration? Yeah. 3 weeks.
Yeah. I mean, and people are going to cite Russia's supposedly repressive laws about censorship, supposedly, and trying to limit foreign influence. It's going to come up when we talk.
Yeah, address it. I mean, I really don't have no problem. Again, I just want to put the information out to the best I know. We study this pretty much on a daily basis, all three of us. And I still can't properly tell you exactly how the ins and outs of every part of the Russian society and culture for people to discuss. Okay, that's that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it makes sense to the Cold War. Like the way the Cold War is taught in U.S. American education system, and I can't even vouch for it today, but like 10 years ago when the Cold War was taught, it was like, oh, it's this very encapsulated period of time, and we've moved away from that scary, frightening time when America was repressive and oppressive and really restrictive and scared. And yet here we are building off of the Red Scare again and again and again, the fears of communism, the fears of socialism, the fears that the world could be a better place. But these other scary people who are actually investing in sustainable energy, who are investing in not being racist, colonizing pieces of shit are the bad guys somehow, is what we're supposed to learn from the U.S. education system. And how the Cold War, I mean, the thing about ideological wars is that they never, ever, ever end.
So if you hate Russia, you hate Russia. Whatever. I'm not getting a check. Tanky, are you getting a check?
I'm not getting a check.
Keita, you getting a check there?
No.
No Putin check. So I don't want to say like we have some sort of, but there's always this conversation like, oh, you have some sort of biases. You just hate. Like I didn't come into this with, I obviously was rooting for the United States. I was born and raised here. So why would I want a good thing for this? It's just always interesting.
It's a geopolitical podcast. It's a geopolitical broadcast. And that requires you to dispassionately listen to the things that leaders around the world are saying and to present that information without bias to the listener. You guys get to make your own decision. I'm not here to tell you Putin is good. I'm not here to tell you Biden is good. I'm not here to tell you any of these people are good or bad. I'm here to tell you what they do, and you can make your own decisions from that.
Yeah, but also, how can we envision a better world if we this is the problem with the United States right now, and being like, well, we know everything right now, and so we can't talk to anybody or engage. As Tanky said, where's that human intelligence, but also that human connection to across the globe, not just, we can barely have a human connection with people across different states in the United States.
Yeah. And so the cultural differences between the US and Russia are immense. So I just want to put that out there. Okay. So there's also an enormous conflict, a hot war in Russia and Ukraine right now, the Donbass, Luhansk area specifically. We have been hearing for quite some time that the Ukrainians are going to stand. They are going to continue to fight. And we're seeing now there is not an election for Zelensky. He has said ain't going to be an election until the war is over, which that's not going to happen because when the war is over, it's going to be over for Ukraine. So you have a person who is not a duly elected leader at this point. Basically, the entire Ukrainian front line is in disarray, and it looks as if Russia will continue to take these huge swaths of land as we move forward. I just wanted to ask, and again, both of y'all can jump in here, sort of the state of Russia and Belarus also, respectfully, is at least a huge part of this, even though they are not directly involved. But Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, U.S., NATO, any of these entities in terms of...
I think you can definitely talk about Belarus, but Zelensky didn't just say he wasn't going to hold elections. His term has expired. This man has no authority except the authority of the human imagination to say he's in charge of Ukraine.
And because he's in charge, he can determine who's not in charge, no matter how irrational it looks, right? So the war starts going bad and they can no longer hide that it's not at a standstill. And what does he do? He fires Zelensky, who's the chief of the military theater. This would be like the president getting rid of Dwight D. Eisenhower in the European campaign during World War II. You just don't.
When you fire your coach in the middle of the season, does that mean the season's going well?
And so he brings in Syrski, who is an intelligence guy, well beloved by the American State Department. He's getting his ass kicked because he didn't predict that the Russians might make a move on the second largest city, which is less than 100 miles away from the Russian border. And so now that Syrski is in, now there's talks that Zelensky wants to fire Syrski. And like, who's left at this point? Like, maybe Budanov, who was maybe going to get the job, but like didn't get the job. Do you go back to Zelensky? Does Syrski, who again is a person who has a history and intel and covert action, does he take this laying down? Does he decide, I think I won't be fired? Like, all of these options are on the table.
There's so much political jostling in a place like Ukraine right now. We already know that, yeah.
It would be very hard for me to let a dude fire me that I feel like is illegitimate in the job in the first place.
Yeah.
No, you don't fire me. I fire you. And that's how you end up with Sisi in control of Egypt.
Yeah, general, because, yeah.
General
Sisi is a general. Yeah, exactly. The conversation is, first of all, the United States continually is having this rhetoric. We've heard Lindsey Graham talk about this. that these DOD guys are full of crap and they don't know what's going on. But when we, look, you can watch Military Summary or even any of these sort of military, just they will talk to you in real time. We're actually watching a war in real time in a way we've never been able to do that before. So it's just so interesting to me that we can use so much propaganda, so much misdirection, so much rhetoric to try to convince people that the Ukrainians are winning when in fact they're losing so bad. Many people said the war was over 6 months ago, and this is just carrying out more and more people dying. And again, we're not affecting, I don't want to say we're, because this is not us, but the United States is not affecting the Russian economy in the way that they wanted to.
The Russian economy is the largest economy in the world by way of growth over the last year.
But also the United States keeps banking on sanctions. And as Tanky has pointed out in previous podcasts and just in like general conversations and essays, is what sanctions do is only matters if you're on the US dollar. And more countries are recognizing this is a scam and I'm going to de-dollarize.
Well, one more thing I would like to say is when we're talking about the dire status of the Ukrainian army, there are two different events that are happening right now that will end the war immediately. Kharkov can fall, right? Again, this is the second largest city
in all of Ukraine.
All of Ukraine. This would be like Houston being taken or
Los
LA.
Angeles or Chicago. Really is.
It's that big a deal. It'd be a game break. It'd be all over. There would be a coup. It's just unavoidable. And the Russians are about 40 kilometers out. They're just outside of artillery range. They've already decapitated the power in that city. And the other thing is Chasiv Yar, the great fortress of Chasiv Yar. That is the last Ukrainian strong point, right? I mean, so when we're talking about the Ukrainian counteroffensive that happened a year ago, they were not able to make it to the first Russian strong point, the so-called Surovikin line. They almost made it to the first line of defense. Russia is now at the literal last line of defense. That is Chasiv Yar. If Chasiv Yar falls, the Ukrainian military probably dissolves. That's it. Yeah. So Chasiv Yar falls, Kharkiv falls. That's it. And the Russians are putting pressure on both.
Right. And not just dissolves like, oh, they vanish, but like they're defecting at higher and higher rates. I feel like we saw this on yesterday's military summary where he was showing that, hey, in the southern parts of Ukraine, those soldiers are trying to get away and run into the border across the borders of other countries because a lot of the European Unions and those bordering countries have shut down their borders to make it. And of course, Zelensky wants all of those countries too to be like, well, if you see Ukrainian citizens, send them back.
See, and so that Keita, that is such a wonderful point that you bring up because it then calls into question, what is a civilian, right? If no one of military age can leave, right, then you're saying de facto, these people are a resource for the military that you intend to tap. Now, what this Ukrainian situation has done is it's really exposed the whole concept of sanctuary in Europe, because all of these men left because they didn't want anything to do with this battle. This is a civil war between Ukraine and Russia. And they didn't want it. And now these people are threatened to be returned back to the battlefronts. I'm hearing reports of people that are literally fighting these recruiters in the streets because they don't want to be sent to to death by the Russians. They don't want to
go fight. They're just regular people, and they don't want to go through some
4 or 5 days of training. Oh, yeah. 4 or 5 days of training and then put on the front line. Russia, at this point, still has 30,000 men in reserve on the line. That's not to say anything of their greater military capacity. Meanwhile, Zelensky has flooded his lines. I can't even say flooded. He's trickled his line with people that were convicted of crimes. And even with that, going to the prisons and saying, I'll give you freedom if you fight for the army, he was only able to pull out 3,000 people. That's not going to tip the scales.
Yeah, and I mean how oblivious they are too, because 10 days ago, Zelensky actually increased the fines for noncompliance with military registration regulations. And so he increased them, and he had the support of parliament to increase them and to impress upon everybody that it is important that we fight for Ukraine down to the last human being, and which is massively irresponsible.
3 million Ukrainians have gone into Russia since the beginning of this war.
And 500,000 Ukrainians have died on the battlefield.
And so many more wounded will never be able to return to the battlefield, have been disabled.
Won't be able to return to the workforce in a regular way. I mean, you're not going to be able to go and work a construction job when you've lost a leg in the war, lost an arm.
Not to mention PTSD and all the mental difficulties that come with being on a battlefield like that.
Yeah, and now massive amounts of debt, because what happened to all of that money? It got funneled into corruption. All of those, majority of the weapons that were funneled to Ukraine are now, we're ending up on the black market in a lot of wild, crazy areas. And so the Ukrainian citizens are going to have to go back to a country that is impoverished into national debt by the EU and the United States purporting to help them. I just always go back to Economic Hitman, the Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and how he absolutely outlines how this happens again and again and again, and how war is a tool to fuel this.
And when you have companies like BlackRock.
I was just about to say, BlackRock owns more land in Ukraine than the Russians do, and no one sees it as an invasion. It's just economics.
Yeah. So, and I read this too. This was something interesting. Before the war, Ukraine was only one of 5 countries that have had a negative GDP over the beginning of the 2000s. So you already had Ukraine an enormous financial hole before any of this conflict even started. And again, because it's ripe for corruption. We've been saying this for years, even before this conflict started. Ukraine is one of the most corrupt places in the world. And we have been sending billions, almost hundreds of billions to Ukraine for this conflict for no reason, just to be left on the battlefield. For God's sakes, the Russians have an area called Bradley Square, where Bradley tanks are just like a freaking graveyard, man. And
personnel carriers, but yes,
personnel carriers. Sorry, but some of the best personnel carriers money can buy.
Right.
I want to ask about this, and either y'all can jump in. We hear about French troops possibly going, and German troops, and English or UK troops. What does NATO have for Russia? Because that seems to be a separate conflict in of itself.
When it comes to exotic weapons, no one knows. Right. There may be some weapon system that hasn't been displayed to anyone, and no one really knows about it. And, these things do happen in war. I remember in the first Gulf War, no one had ever seen a smart bomb. No one had ever seen a stealth plane that could fly and not be easily detected by radar.
Also, the terrifying chemical weapons. I just think about Agent Orange. I think about all of we don't know. We never know until they're deployed in a time of war, which is terrifying.
But the one thing that NATO does have is a preponderance of nuclear weapons. This is the one thing that they have left. This is the card they have left. And what's happened when we talk about what a proxy war is, why it's so dangerous, this is the thing. Ukraine, of its own industrial capacity to make war with Russia, this would have been over in less than a month, right? But the fact is they've been stuffed full of Western weapons, not just Western weapons, but they're being given intel from Western satellites. Western specialists are doing guidance and training on how to utilize these weapons. And at some point, you have to ask yourself, who's really hitting Russia? So now we're at a point where even though it's the Ukrainians that are delivering the munitions are coming from Western countries and the United States. And they're doing things that are quite provocative. Over the last week, the Ukrainians hit a nuclear early warning detection radar. Like, that's not the kind of thing that you would hit just to prove a point, right? Normally, it's the kind of thing you would hit as a as a opening act to a first strike,
Yeah,
right?
possibly. It's
And
an
that
incredibly provocative act.
incredibly
And
provocative.
it only seems they do these types of things because they cannot affect Russia militarily. They have to hit Crimean bridges and they have to hit civilian targets and they have to possibly, you know, uh, engage in terrorist activities. And you don't see
It's
this
a
idea of
it's a
war.
it's a catch-22 that you just can't avoid when you're dealing with American hegemony. So the Ukrainians have the right to be independent and not to have to deal with Russia if they want. But the Luhansk and the Donetsk areas, which voted for independence, right? They don't have that right. They don't have the right to be independent nations. They don't have that right to reach out to Russia to have perhaps defense. They don't have that right to vote to become part of the
Yeah.
Russian
And if
Federation.
and then you have to ask yourself this, if Ukraine doesn't want the Russians to be there so badly, why did all the people in Luhansk and the Donetsk, why do they continue to side with Russia? Why is there no pushback in those areas? Why? Because when you occupy a country like maybe Israel occupied Palestine, you have a lot of pushback by the civilian population there. And right now we don't see that in the Donetsk area.
But the problem with power projection is you have to be a bully all day, 24/7. You can't stop being a bully. And what they're starting to see in the rest of the world is the United States can no longer meet the supply that their allies need to achieve the success that they need to see realized to maintain their hegemonic grip on the world. The Taiwanese are looking at a Ukrainian nation having logistics issues, even though they're sharing a border with NATO partners. Now, Taiwan, right? Not a nation, an island that is a part of China, that's part of the one China policy that the United States agrees with, that Japan agrees with, the United Nations Security Council agrees with, the EU agrees with. All of these people have a contractual obligation to respect this policy called the One China policy, where they acknowledge that Taipei, more commonly known as Taiwan in America, is a semi-autonomous region that's able to do things, right? But it's still part of China, just like Tibet, just like Xinjiang province, just like Macau, just like Hong Kong, right? These areas have a degree of autonomy, but at the end of the day, they still belong to a greater China. A comparison of this would be, however sloppily, Puerto Rico, right? Puerto Rico is part of America, right? Nominally, until other changes happen. Even though it's not a state, it's not represented in Congress in a traditional way, right? That is the relationship that you could compare China and Taipei to, except one little thing, and that's the fact that Taipei has been part of China longer than the United States has existed as a country.
And that's great that you bring that up, because that really moves us into sort of this new battlefront that the United States seems to be desperate to open up.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is Taiwan, not to mention these bases in the Philippines, which we've been discussing, not to mention the conflict in Korea, and the most militarized border in the world. And I would be remiss to say some place like Australia, who has been gifted nuclear submarines by the United States. And Tanky always talks about nuclear submarines being the most dangerous of all weapons. Staying. Can you
Nuclear
talk?
submarines by far eclipse the firepower of an aircraft carrier. By far. Every aircraft carrier that exists is, you see them coming a mile away. It takes huge fleets to maintain them. They themselves are not great fighters. They need other ships to help fight for them. You need corvettes, you need support ships, you need frigates, you need missile destroyers. When you see an aircraft carrier convoy, it's impossible to mistake what's happening. You never see a nuclear submarine. They're just underwater, waiting for orders to deliver, right? And this is the kind of technology that very few countries possess of their own. Even Australia, which is a turnkey nuclear state, like Brazil, like Iran, right? A turnkey nuclear state is a country that has all of the technology it needs to utilize the power of the atom, but has not yet chosen to make nuclear weapons, though you have the technology to create one and the threshold to do it should you choose, right? Australia is in that place. Japan is another great example of a turnkey nuclear power. So they have the technology to do this conceptually, but they don't have. It's hard to get nuclear weapons legally, right? There is a whole non-proliferation pact that most countries are part of. So what they've done is they've circumvented this by the letter of the law, right? By Americans being the maintainers of these ships, and they're working with the Australians in this newish military alliance called Quad, which is Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. It's also referred as AUKUS sometimes. There's a little AUKUS is pretty much the same thing, except India is not a part of that. But both of these organizations exist to maintain and contain China's rise.
So I just want to mention this, and anybody can jump in. We talked about this with Russia. You may hate Russia. I mean, you may hate China. Again, I don't know quite the reasons why you would, but you may hate China. Here's what I know. I know that there is no homelessness in a place like China, which has 1.5 billion people. They have EVs for as low as $2,000. So important and proficient in what they do, that the United States has to put a 100% tariff on them. And it is interesting to me that over the last 40 years, do you know how many bombs China has dropped?
How many?
On a civilian population? Zero. So when we talk sort of about like this, like the military posturing or the bullying of a place like China, why don't they utilize the weapons that they have? Like the United States obviously does. They use their weapons and they have proxy wars in places like Ukraine and Israel, and they have, but China
and in Korea.
Well, the Chinese official foreign policy is to have what they call win-win cooperation. They recently just had a summit with South Korea and Japan in ways that they could explore. Again, these are two nations that are 100%
U.S. proxies.
And yet China still makes the overtures.
But it's a cultural difference too, right? Because you just spoke to that earlier in the podcast. And the United States is not about learning cultural differences. We can see this in a lot of the rhetoric that happened around immigration entirely, which is it's a melting pot and you have to be absolutely homogenous to the American machine, and then try to be like, oh, I guess we're like a salad. We mix it up, but it's still everything under the auspice and overseeing of the United States. But it's a different cultural practice and way of being, and it's built like that over centuries. We talk about the age of the United States as a country and as a global power, and the steps that it's taken in imperialism, and how countries who are thousands of years old are looking at the United States, much like, okay, you're a youngin', like, please calm down. But we've reached a different level of maturity in what we need to be able to achieve. And you don't have to break everything. You don't have to break the world just to prove you're right about something. It's not about being right.
Democrats are supposed to be the party of the working man. So then explain to me how you can, in good conscience, right, put sanctions on EV cars. So first off, Joe Biden likes to imagine himself as some type of environmentalist, in spite of the fact that his direct rhetoric, let's say at the least his rhetoric, it can be contributed to the destruction of the Nord Stream. He has opened more Arctic drilling than any president in the history of America, right? EV cars, which we were supposed to change the world, they're coming off the Chinese line and they're ready to go at $2,000 American dollars.
Meanwhile, what does a Tesla cost? I mean, it's like $70K.
And they're
That's not affordable for a normal person.
not affordable, right? To say nothing of taste, they're not affordable. So then when you're looking at these Chinese cars, you're talking about a car now that the working man might be able to put, instead of a down payment on with 2 paychecks, you might be able to buy this car off. You don't have to worry about your credit score. You don't have to worry about, are they going to come and take this car away from you?
I even think about it with the cell phones, where I was looking at getting a Huawei phone years ago because
The
I was like,
world's number one phone, by the way.
yeah, no, world's number one phone that it was compatible with all of the market. And I mean, this is the lie of the free market, because if it were actually free, we wouldn't have all of these bans supposedly. But I couldn't get, how about this? I could have bought a Huawei phone. And yet what my mobile carrier said was, yeah, but we can't connect it to the United States net. Like, we can't connect it to the network. So you're just going to have a phone that doesn't work. And it's like, okay, well, then that absolutely deters me from buying a phone, because I need a phone that works so I can keep in touch with people that I need to keep in touch with. But like, this is the absurdity on it. And as Tanky said, those tariffs are on EVs, but they're also on healthcare items, masks, medical equipment. Like, why are you putting a tariff on things that like people need access to? That the United States kind of does this around the globe, because I think about that with like the Drug Enforcement Agency and how right now people aren't getting access to their medications. And it's not even about the opioid crisis, but was fueled by those fears conducted under that, and how we don't have access to ADHD medication, that we don't have access to insulin. And it's because Biden and any presidential, like US presidential administration determines, oh, is this economically viable for the United States? Well, we don't care. We're going to charge it because we want to make other countries economically poor, and rather than make the world into a better, more sustainable place to live for humans.
Yeah, so obviously the United States has an issue with China. Other places have an issue with China, even though we see that all of the manufacturing jobs in the 90s left to go to China, and they were okay with it. It seemed to me they were fine with it as long as the labor costs were low and all the production costs were low. But
which
now
again, this happens right under Bill Clinton, right? So like, this is what you have to look at, like, because the Democrats have been the de facto face of globalization for the past 40 years, undeniably. And these were good American jobs. These were threats that the power establishment from America presented towards the workers to further destroy the leveraging power of the unions.
Yeah, the organized labor going to get demolished with the manufacturing field, which had really strong labor unions.
And now you hear these things about how China steals. Like, China doesn't steal American technology because most Chinese
they make it
is better. Yeah,
they make American technology. So when you make American technology, you understand how all the parts work and you create your own. That's not stealing the technology. You make the technology.
This is how capitalism is supposed to be structured. We told corporations, you're a person, you have feelings and religion and rights more than an actual human being. And that, hey, if you want to take all of your manufacturing overseas so that you can further exploit your workers and make billions on the dollar, then go for it.
And it's not like American product prices went down, right? So you destroyed the labor cost. So you have incredible profits, and that those values never they never trickled down.
They just went to the stock market and stayed in an inflated state to push, the American GDP continually higher and higher.
To keep the Dow Jones higher. Yeah.
So okay. So we touched on so many things. I wanted to ask you again because obviously, there's been a lot of rhetoric sort of surrounding North Korea in the United States for quite some time, as long as I can remember. And there's always sort of been this conversation amongst the Korean populace of reunification. It seems like it's something that the people want. But earlier this year, we had Kim Jong-un come out and say, that's dead. That's not going to happen. And, thought we were getting close sort of in the Trump presidency. I don't want to overplay what was going to possibly happen, but it now seems like it's off the table. And I just wanted to talk about like sort of the state of the Korean Peninsula in terms of global conflict.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely connected to the global conflict because we talked about the Cold War, and the division and the hope for reunification for Korea absolutely is steeped in the Cold War, where Russia and the United States decided to divide the country absolutely in half, also so that United States could have more military bases in East Asia in order to move against China if they needed to. But and this is something that the United States political parties do too, that no matter who's in charge of the administration, that the United States absolutely favors and really favors division in a way, right? Because when I grew up, we just talked about Korea as Korea. That like separate forced division was something that the United States and Russia created, but that wasn't tangibly real in some ways. And so what the United States banked on is that there's going to be enough of a generational divide that we won't have to worry about it, that people won't even think about, like, South Koreans might not even think about themselves as culturally Korean, because we see this in other parts of the country that have absolutely been colonized by Britain and by the United States. And what China in particular is facing as well because of US interference in, hey, who do you want to be culturally aligned with? And it can't be communism because communism is bad and scary. And how they use that absolutely against the Koreans, because there is now enough of a generational divide that they're not connected by families. But I was, that we knew we absolutely had family in what's considered North Korea now, and that because of the border and because of US militarization, that we were separated, but the hope was always that we would be back together as an entire family. And how what the United States administration ended up doing was, well, if enough generations passed, you're not going to have that family connection because we never let y'all see each other. And so those familial and human connections start to erode. And then what happens too is, like, language shifts, that you're going to have linguistic drift. And if you get enough generations going with that linguistic drift, are you even going to be speaking the same version of Korea? You're going to separate into different dialects. And then how does that help bridge the gap between like us unifying into a single country, and how the United States absolutely fuels that never happening? I mean, they installed a president that has zero legislative experience, that he absolutely supposedly was like, hey, you know what? My university career was all about hunting down corruption, only for him to get suspended from his role for corruption. And then here he is, president in 2022 of South Korea, and has no legislative experience. Being president of the country is his first elected office. And we can get into arguments about, like, should politics be a career, and how do we ensure that the people that we vote for and place in power are the people who are most equipped to execute the people's will in ways that they want and to be able to maneuver on a global scale. And this man has none of that experience. And we're supposed to take him seriously as anything, as like a president of an entire country, rather than absolutely fully the United States puppet. And we see the United States do this multiple times in multiple countries, where you're installing people that are not equipped to be leaders, Zelensky. And then you start blaming that country for, like, well, you elected this person. Look at how dumb these people are. And it feeds back into those racist notions and the cultural misunderstandings about, like, what options do people have when someone like the United States absolutely interferes in elections on such a scale that they can position their people in power, that by the time the vote comes, who are you voting for? Two people in the two United States proxies, which was the case with Korea. They had two shit options.
And the one thing I would say is, people think because, again, sanctions, right? If you don't have dollars, you can't do anything. That's just not true. People develop other ways of coping when their economy is attacked by these economic sanctions, which are, again, an act of war. So what you have now is in North Korea, that because it's been isolated from the West assumes it's been isolated from everyone. They continue to do what they have to do to maintain their existence. It's existential, because they understand the United States will never allow there to be a peaceful coalition that brings together a North and a South Korea. So you understand the only way this can end is militarily. This has allowed them to become one of the largest producers of ammunition in the world, so much so that the Russians in their special military operation go to North Korea, and they're like, yo, we need to buy 155 millimeter shells. And of course, because of their relationship that goes all the way back to the Soviets, actually before that, even when we're talking about what history means between these nations and these people, they have those relationships. So North Korea has become one of the largest providers of perhaps the most important battlefield munition in the world today. In exchange, the rumors are that Russia provided some technological assistance as far as their rocket program, which allowed them to put their first satellite into space.
And it's irresponsible, okay? Because I feel like we talked about this in a previous podcast and maybe not, but that essentially North Korea is under some of the strictest sanctions the world has known. And that absolutely the United States uses this because it's under the understanding that, hey, if we starve your people, you're going to revolt against your country. And then we can say that we were just helping you revolt, even though we absolutely committed and contributed to the atrocities that you're facing now. And that we lie. So we're going to say like, oh, no, it's not about North Korea having a different ideology than us. And it's true. They did. This is why you divided the country in half. But it's also that, oh, no, they're pursuing nuclear weapons. And I say it's irresponsible because the moment nuclear weapons existed, and particularly for East Asians who had to watch 2 nuclear bombs that the United States dropped on Japan, and then for the United States to impose across the globe saying, well, nobody else can have this. We're the only ones who can be responsible with it, even though we're the only ones who have ever dropped nuclear bombs domestically and internationally. And so we imposed these sanctions on North Korea, and then we got the UN Security Council to back all of these sanctions in order to starve the people. And yet what we've learned is nothing, because like Iran, like North Korea, like Cuba, all of these countries that have faced sanctions, is that people persevere and that they will find a way to kind of figure things out. And it rallies people in a way that the United States absolutely cannot understand because of its ego in many ways, and because of its short-sightedness and not being able to think in many ways long-term to, hey, what does it mean? And a lot of that's steeped in this culture of capitalism and short-term profits rather than long-term gains and being sustainable. But we told North Korea, oh, we're going to keep these sanctions on you because you are pursuing nuclear weapons, even though we know Israel has access to nuclear weapons, and that other countries do too. And so we contribute
without being members of the non-proliferation treaty.
Yes. And so we contribute to these conditions that these countries have to face. And China still has to go with grace to meet with Japan and South Korea, both of whom who want to talk to China about, well, if North Korea starts a war, if they kick off World War III, you have to condemn them. You have to pre-condemn for things that haven't even happened. They've only happened in the imagination, and how the United States is maneuvering these countries in a way that tries to serve the West and is not serving anybody. Because we're suffering here domestically, and we have a wealth disparity that is now going into the trillions of dollars. And it's in this lifetime, you cannot possibly spend that. You have individuals have more money than whole countries. And somehow we think this is the best economic system in the world.
Great points. Something that comes to mind, is that we know that South Korea has the lowest birth rates of any country in the world. And Japan is also very low. The United States just came out. I believe that this is one of their lowest birth rates. And it's just interesting to see, what happens when you install these so-called democracies that's full of, these all capitalist luxuries and things like that. It just tends to make the culture become more ruggedly individual, and you don't have as many of those communal conversations, or at least the communal
you don't have a life
vibe.
That's so good you cannot wait to procreate and bring more life into this world.
And that's
not
what
your life
we
is like.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot happening in Korea around that, and a lot of it is fueled by honestly President Yoon and what he's instituted. And I mean, we could, it just feels like a whole expansive kind of argument, but these are the pressures the United States puts on other countries in a way. And then these countries, people try to respond in a way that's we have to be able to take back control of our lives and have some agency over what happens to us. And this is how we know we're connected across the globe, because all of our governments are shit. All of them.
Yeah, they're so especially when your leaders are constantly Western backed. There's a lot to talk about, and I just want to touch on a few of them if we can. We mentioned India. India is the most populous country in the world now. They just passed China last year. They do not have a birth rate issue, but they are becoming more and more and more prominent in the geopolitical stage. And we also know that there are tensions between China, but there are also reasons to be cool with China. Obviously, being a part of BRICS. India just are having elections. I'm sure. I know Modi is looking to be reelected. Where does India land in all this in terms of the global state of conflict?
I mean, to me, India represents this key, right? They do business with everyone. No one really has them all the way figured out since they've broken away from the British Empire. Their largest supplier of military technology has been Russia, right? Their largest supplier of petroleum is Russia, right? They have a huge amount of workforce that does business with Israel. They work with the United States in some areas of military cooperation, especially as far as like naval cooperation, right? And they have their own particular Hindu perspectives, right? And I don't want to look at India as strictly a Hindu state, but more and more you're moving in that way.
And especially the nationalists, the Hindu nationalism.
The party that Modi represents is absolutely a Hindu nationalist party, right? And he's in power, and there's every reason to believe that he's going to win this election again. So that's at least 5 more years of power to the Hindu nationalist. They're in a tough spot because they're still working on what their own identity is, what that represents. I feel like they do business with a lot of people with very tenuous connections, right? They don't want to be seen as pro-Western. They don't want to be seen as anti-Western. And so I believe in the next 30 to 40 years, we're going to really watch them continue to develop. The biggest problem haunting India is they have not, like China, found a way to combat the rampant poverty. I mean, abject poverty that exists in that nation. Now, again,
that was exacerbated by the pandemic because they were exporting all of the vaccines and medical equipment and protective gear outside of the country instead of even giving it to their own citizens.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. There's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot left. So I want to go ahead and just stop it right here. We can bring back a part 2. I think if folks are interested in that, we really dove in, y'all. I'm really appreciative to y'all. I want to say we're on YouTube, Apple Podcast, Spotify, iHeart, Player FM. You can follow us on Instagram at Inner City Left, our Patreon, patreon.com//Inner City Left. We have deals. We got deals as low as $5. And I appreciate y'all. As always, any final thoughts before we get out of here from either Lil Tanky or the Ghost in the Shell, Keita?
I mean, there's so much happening across the globe, but I value the human connection because what Amin and Tanky were saying was that folks miss the podcast, and I exist in a bubble in which it's like, oh, people outside can perceive. And so it's things like we're here because there is so much happening in the world, and that folks appreciated our voice in that. So thank you.
And there it is.
All right, me and TMK, Emoji, Lil Tanky, Somewhere, Keita the Muscle, and we out.
Deuces.
System riding to the core. Yeah. Reppin' in the city left.